White executive told black cook to get out of the kitchen. 3 days later, he begged for an autograph. What happens when a white investor tells a black chef to get back in the kitchen? He never imagined that just weeks later, he'd be asking that same man for an autograph. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. Garrett James wasn't a chef by trade. He was a chef by blood, by fire, by the stubborn grace of generations who turned scraps into sanctuaries. His grandmother used to simmer sauces so rich they made grown men cry, and not one of those tears came from onions. His grandfather fried chicken with a crust that crackled like the 4th of July, and you could hear it popping 3 porches away. Garrett didn't learn to cook. He inhaled it. Before he could read, he could measure spice in the palm of his hand. Before he could write, he could bone a fish with the precision of a surgeon and the tenderness of a prayer. He never wore one of those tall white hats. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because he understood. Respect isn't in your hat, it's in your hands. It's in the way you lay down a plate and look somebody in the eyes as if to say, "Here, this is a piece of my story. I dare you to forget the taste." That morning started like most, at 5 a.m., when the city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes and trying to remember what day it was. Garrett's hands already knew what to reach for before his mind fully clocked in. Rice on the stove, slow and sweet in coconut milk, just like his mama showed him. Fried plantains swimming in warm honey syrup, letting out that satisfying hiss, psst, that let him know everything was lining up. Garrett didn't just cook food, he healed spirits. He settled scores with spice and told history with sauce. Then she arrived, Miss Ellison, 84 years old, wheelchair. 2 strokes behind her and a spirit strong enough to quiet a room. She never showed up without her lipstick, fire truck red like it was 1963. And Garrett, he didn't let the waitress carry her plate. Her bones were too thin. And frankly, he felt it wasn't anyone's business but his to bring that woman her food. That was his queen, his elder. He stepped out of the kitchen with a plate of lemon garlic shrimp and candied yams arranged like it was the Last Supper, leaned gently toward her like he was serving royalty, and watched her whole face bloom like morning sun. That was the moment. In came him, Charles Reed, the new investor, fresh off some deal in Dallas, tall, pressed, and white as bone china. The type who walks into a room like he owns the lease on the air. He strutted through the dining room like he was appraising furniture, eyes sharp and sweeping. And then, he saw Garrett, right there, standing by the table, apron on, plate empty, job done, and that's when it happened. "Hey," Charles barked, loud enough to stop forks in midair. "Who told you to come out here? Who said the kitchen could walk?" Silence fell like a brick. People froze mid-chew. Garrett turned around slowly, not out of fear, but because dignity moves at its own pace. He looked Charles dead in the eye, steady and clear. And in that look was a whole lifetime of, "Boy, don't you know who I am?" "I brought Miss Ellison her meal," Garrett said, voice even like a cast iron skillet. "She can't hold a tray. I didn't want her struggling. You're the chef. Your place is in the kitchen. Not out here putting on a show," Charles snapped. "This isn't a food truck. Get back where you belong." Somebody coughed. A couple folks looked away. Miss Ellison, bless her heart, leaned in and whispered just loud enough, "Don't you mind him, baby. Your hands carry soul." Garrett didn't throw the plate. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded, quiet, steel in his spine, and walked back to the kitchen. But something snapped inside, because that wasn't about protocol. That wasn't about rules. That was about color, about place, about the way Charles Reed looked at him and didn't see skill or experience or legacy. Just staff, just help, just another black man needing to be kept in his place. That was the old voice, the same voice that's echoed in schools, offices, sidewalks. That ancient American phrase, dressed up in new suits, "Know your place." Garrett stood over a bubbling pot of soup, the heat rising up to meet his face, but it wasn't pepper that made his eyes burn. It was the insult. It was being told in front of guests and elders that his talent had a boundary, and that boundary was the kitchen door. All his years, 5 in that building, pouring sweat into that stove, designing every sauce, building a menu from the bones of his childhood, reduced to some investor's throwaway comment. Carmen, a longtime waitress and one of the few people in that place who saw him, leaned into the kitchen. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "Is he serious?" Garrett shook his head slowly. "You think he came here for the culture? For the food? He came to flip a profit, and we're just the seasoning." He looked down at a bowl of soup, his soup, steaming and rich with depth. But all he saw now was a reflection of himself, of how many more bowls he'd serve with someone else's name on the door. How many more times am I going to pour my heart into a plate just to see it posted online with someone else taking the credit? He took off his apron, not in a rage, not in defeat, but with the calm of a man making a decision. The kind of calm that makes folks nervous, because it means you're not just upset, you're done. He hung the apron on the hook, wiped his hands, walked past Charles Reed without even flinching, didn't look at him, didn't need to. And again, Miss Ellison, quiet royal, said only, "Go in peace, darling." Garrett stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter, like the city was finally breathing in sync with him. That night, the restaurant kept serving. The chairs were full, the chatter resumed, but something was missing. The plates looked the same, technically, but the flavor? It was like a love song sung out of tune. The staff scrambled, following printed recipes Garrett had once scribbled on napkins and whiteboards. But food ain't math, it's rhythm, and none of them could feel when the sauce was right. They only knew when it wasn't. The next day, the first bad reviews rolled in on social media. Something's off. Food's not the same. Where's the old chef? Garrett didn't return. And for the first time in his polished career, Charles Reed felt it. Not fear of failure, but fear of being seen. Because the truth was leaking, plate by plate. One food blogger wrote, "I drove across town for that smoky sweet flavor. The dish came, but the soul didn't." Charles tried to save face, claimed they were modernizing the menu, claimed the chef was taking a break, but the customers weren't buying it. One reporter finally asked the question out loud, "Where's Chef James?" And just like that, the title hit him like a slap. Chef James. A name Charles had refused to say, now hanging in the air like judgment. Garrett wasn't on a couch, licking his wounds. He wasn't posting sad quotes online. He was working, quietly, preparing. He submitted an application to the biggest culinary competition in the region, and he submitted it with the very recipe that had once been served to humiliate him. When asked for the name of the dish, Garrett smiled and said, "Voice from the kitchen." When a white man loses a recipe that makes him money, he doesn't go looking for the chef. He goes hunting for someone to blame. That's just the way it works in certain circles. And Charles Reed? By day 3 without Garrett, his face looked like someone made him eat unsalted rice at a corporate retreat. Wide-eyed, lips tight, soul somewhere between denial and discomfort. His empire of flavor had started to smell like bland apologies. Dishes were getting sent back. The online reviews dipped from savory joy to fast food dressed up in fancy plates. Charles began to panic, and a panicking man with power is never good for business. But let's not rush too fast. Let's rewind. Garrett wasn't sleeping, but it wasn't fear that kept him up. It was fire, inspiration. While Charles was pacing kitchens in polished shoes, Garrett was in his modest apartment, standing over a gas stove, building something sacred. His space had turned into a culinary lab. He worked with rhythm, not timers, intuition, not instruction. He wasn't following trends. He was reclaiming stories. The dish he was perfecting, voice from the kitchen. Fried chicken laced with peach glaze that kissed your memory and your trauma at the same time. Spiced sweet rice with a whisper of coriander smoke that made your nose twitch and your eyes water. Not from heat, but from history. The sauce, tangy, slow, bittersweet, carried the weight of funerals and Sunday worship all at once. This wasn't food, it was protest. It was poetry on a plate. Garrett knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just entering a contest. He was walking into a system that had told him his talent had no name unless someone else signed it. And he was bringing receipts. Literal ones. Recipes, handwritten, with every seasoning drawn from his soul. Meanwhile, Saffron and Oak was sinking like a ship with holes poked in it by its own captain. Charles stalked the back kitchen like a general whose soldiers were too tired to salute. His chefs, barely out of culinary school, looked like lost boys without a map. They were flipping through Garrett's old notes, squinting at spice measurements, guessing at textures. One even suggested adding ketchup to the house glaze. "Ketchup," Charles barked as if the suggestion was a personal attack. "This is not a drive-through." Carl, one of the sous chefs, muttered under his breath. Without Garrett, that's exactly what it is. The place had lost its heartbeat, and in typical fashion, Charles didn't stop to ask why. He just did what men like him do when they feel their grip slipping. He made noise. He sat down for an interview with a local food magazine and declared, with the same confident smile he wore when he handed out termination notices, "Saffron and Oak has always been my concept, my vision, my palette. We've had some great talent in the kitchen, but the style, that's mine." Garrett was reading the article over morning coffee. He choked mid-sip, eyes wide, then laughed out loud. Not a joyful laugh, a deep, weary chuckle that comes from realizing people will lie with a straight face even when everyone's holding the truth in their hands. "Your palate," he said to no one in particular. "Brother, you don't even know how not to burn garlic. You thought truffle oil was a dipping sauce." He didn't clap back online. He didn't post screenshots or hashtags. He got back to work, studied the names of the judges for the upcoming Best Played in the South competition, watched tapes of past winners, rewrote his dish description until it sounded like a hymn. There was no mention of Charles, no anger in the ingredients, but the dish itself, it spoke volumes. Loud, proud, final. Then came the blow. A food blogger with a loyal following of 200,000 strolled into Saffron and Oak for a surprise review. 2 bites into his entree, he waved down the server, laid his fork down, and walked out. His review? What happened to this place? The flavor's gone. That soulful chef, where'd he go? This is airport lounge food now. The post went viral. And when it did, one of the former waiters posted a TikTok that lit the fuse. Garrett was the soul of that restaurant. Charles Reed tried to own him like he owns shares. Don't support places where black talent is disrespected and discarded. The internet moved fast. Reservations dropped like loose change. Customers posted side-by-sides of then and now dishes. And the verdict was clear. Flavor had left the building. Charles, unused to being questioned, tried the oldest trick in the book. He reached for control. He dialed Garrett. No answer. He called again. Garrett declined. Third time? A voicemail. Charles sounded less like a CEO and more like a man realizing his reflection didn't match reality. "Garrett, listen, we both know what happened. Let's not let it get out of hand. I'm open to renegotiating. Credit, return terms. Let's talk. We can work something out." Garrett listened in silence, then hit delete. He didn't need a deal. He didn't need a label. What he needed was dignity. And you can't negotiate that. Not when someone already tried to strip it off you in public. The following night, Garrett sat on a folding chair in his small apartment, laptop open, apron still tied. He was giving his first ever on-camera interview for a YouTube channel focused on Black culinary excellence. 1.2 million subscribers, mostly older folks who knew the difference between cooking and feeding. He sat against a backdrop of peeling kitchen tile, hands resting calmly in his lap. "This dish isn't just food," he said, voice steady. "It's memory. It's resistance. It's that moment when you bring a plate to an elder because her hands shake too much, and you get told to get back in the kitchen, like your care ain't worth nothing unless it's served with silence." The comments rolled in like thunder. "This man cooks with his ancestors behind him. I'm not eating another plate at that restaurant. We ride with Chef James. Let the investor eat his ego." Hours later, Garrett got the email. "Congratulations. You've been selected as a finalist for Best Plate in the South. See you in Savannah, Georgia." He stared at the screen, not smiling, not celebrating, just breathing. Deep, purposeful, like the world had finally said, "We see you, Charles." He didn't sleep that night. His phone rang at 6:02 a.m. His PR rep sounded like a weather alert. "We've lost 5 contracts. You're trending, but not in a good way." Words like exploitation and bias are in headlines. "That YouTube video has 300,000 views. You need to fix this. Fast." "What do you mean?" Charles croaked. "I offered to bring him back. He's ignoring me." "Then you go where he is. You show up. You eat your words in front of people." Charles sat down slowly. "You're telling me to go to the competition?" "Exactly, and maybe bring a Sharpie. You might need his autograph." Savannah greeted Garrett James not with sunshine or celebration, but with that southern kind of air. Thick, humid, and clinging like judgment. The kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, it spoke to you, whispered in your ear like some nosy relative, poking at your nerves and saying, "You sure you belong here?" Garrett stood on the steps of the convention hall, reading the banner overhead. "Best Played in the South, or finals." He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His hands steady, his steps deliberate. He wasn't just walking into a competition. He was walking in as a fact. Inside, the hall sparkled like a jewelry case. Cameras spun silently on tracks, their red lights glowing like quiet threats. This was national, being streamed to thousands. The kind of stage people spend whole careers dreaming of. Judges were seated like royalty. 2 former Michelin star chefs, one a food anthropologist who wrote best-selling books about culinary heritage. The kitchens were open, spotless, bare. No place to hide, no room for error. The crowd filled the air with a nervous, reverent hum, like church before the sermon. Garrett stepped into his station, laid out his tools, his ingredients, the apron wrapped tight around his waist, his sleeves rolled up. He didn't smile. He didn't pose. He just started moving. Smooth, sharp, like his body already knew the steps of a ritual handed down through generations. He chopped, he marinated, he glazed, like his hands were translating a language most people had forgotten, but his blood remembered. No theatrics, just precision, focus, grace under fire. This was his moment, sure, but it wasn't about revenge or applause. It was about presence, proof. Every slice of peach, every brush of glaze, every perfectly placed grain of rice whispered what words couldn't. You erased me before. Now try ignoring this. He plated the dish like memory, careful, personal, sacred. A fried chicken breast lacquered in sweet peach glaze, resting over spiced rice tinged with coriander smoke, flanked by collard greens and yams arranged with the discipline of art. On the side, his now signature sauce, sour, sweet, honest, like grief dressed for Sunday dinner. And just as he reached for the last garnish, he heard it, a murmur, a shuffle. That collective rustle a crowd makes when something unexpected walks in. A voice echoed over the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest in the audience, the founder of one of Atlanta's most talked about restaurants. Please welcome Mr. Charles Reed. If air could groan, that room would have moaned out loud. Charles walked in dressed to impress. Tailored navy blazer, shiny shoes, tie knotted just so. But his face didn't match the suit. His confidence, once smug and swollen, looked drained now. Pale, pinched, deflated by truth. He didn't wave. He didn't beam. He barely made eye contact. He walked like a man who was there not by choice, but because his reputation had dragged him in by the collar. He leaned in and whispered to the event organizer, then turned and walked toward Garrett. Garrett didn't look up. He focused on his plate, brushing the basil leaves just right. The sauce had to be perfect. Every drop had to mean something. Charles stepped within a few feet, then reached for the microphone they'd reluctantly handed him. Judges, guests, I need to say something. A few weeks ago, I made a mistake, a public one. I disrespected someone who was the heart of my business. And I've learned that you can't own talent. You can't bottle it, brand it, or buy it. Talent doesn't belong to money. It belongs to the person born with it. Garrett, you made this dish. You carried that restaurant. I came here not just to apologize, but to ask for your autograph. The crowd went dead quiet. Garrett finally lifted his eyes. Not angry, not smug, calm. He placed the last touch on the plate, then turned to one of the assistants and took the marker, held out like a torch being passed in ceremony. And without a word, he bent down and signed the rim of the plate. Chef G.J. No applause burst forth. Instead, there was a pause, a breath, then a slow, reverent wave of clapping, like the kind you hear in church when the truth has landed too heavy to shout about. The judges took their spoons. The Frenchman closed his eyes on the first bite, his face folding softly like he was being hugged by a memory. One of the women, a Creole chef from New Orleans, dabbed her eyes and said softly, "This is not just a dish. This is a survival story. This is a hymn wrapped in heat and sweetness." The scores? All tens. The verdict? Already written in the room. The winner of Best Plate in the South is Chef Garrett James. But trophies are hollow if you've already built something heavier. Garrett didn't jump. He didn't weep. He bowed slightly, respectfully, firmly, then walked off the stage. Outside, the crowd had already begun to swell, but it wasn't paparazzi or press he saw first. It was a wheelchair, and in it, wearing her red lipstick like a crown, Miss Ellison. Her sign read, "Voice from the kitchen, my hero." Garrett walked straight to her, kneeled beside her like a grandson to an elder. "You started this," he whispered. "No, baby," she said, touching his shoulder. "You just didn't let them end it in silence." And as for saffron and oak, it limped along for 11 more days, then shuddered. Charles tried to pivot, posting tearful apology videos, rambling about reflection and growth. But the public wasn't biting. People had tasted the real thing. And once you've had truth seasoned just right, no amount of corporate spin can mask the blandness of fake. A month later, Garrett opened his own place. No big launch, no influencers, just a modest sign above the door. Chef G.J., No Excuses Kitchen. The line wrapped around the block. No gimmicks, no pretense, just soul food. Honest, elevated, unbought. A local reporter came in for a feature story. Near the end of the meal, he asked the tired old question reporters always seem to ask, "What would you say to Charles Reed now, if you had the chance?" Garrett looked up from his prep counter, wiped his hands on his apron. "Nothing," he said. "He already heard me." He nodded toward the sauce bubbling behind him. "He heard me through that, through the silence, through the name on that plate." And with that, he turned back to the stove. Because the real victory wasn't the prize money or the press or the applause. It was the chicken. Fried just right, plated with purpose, served under his name and no one else's.